Hi, I'm playing the role of Jane in this video, and I'll be creating a data sync between a CSV file, that will be my source, and a Cinchy table, my target. Let's take a look at both the source and the target. For this sync, we're going to be loading data from the Contact Williams Inc. CSV to the Contacts table in Cinchy. When I look at my source and target, I can see that there are a few differences between the two. They are not a one-to-one match. I can see here that my contact table has a name column, where in my source, the CSV file has both a first and a last name column. We also have link columns in our target. For example, the company column here. When we build out our sync, we'll need to take these things into consideration. Time to build the sync now. There are 3 sections the sync is broken into. The info section, this holds details such as the name, version, and any parameters you'll be using within the sync. The data source, this outlines the columns that are in the source, in this example, the columns that are in the CSV load file. The sync target, this is where all the columns for the source will be mapped into the target. You also have the ability to save the data sync here, view any jobs that are currently in progress, or run the current job, which is the sync you're building. Let's start by setting up the info tab of the sync. I'll go ahead and enter in the name of the sync. The version number is pre-populated for you. If you already have a naming and a version convention, please feel free to continue to use it. We have the option to set up a parameter. In this instance, we'll be setting up a parameter for the file path for where the source resides. Parameters are useful as they allow your data syncs to be flexible. If you're creating a new sync in the future, you can always replicate an existing sync and modify it. Great, let's look at how to set up the source now. I can see in the source drop-down list all the possible sources I can connect to. Since this is a CSV file we're syncing into Cinchy, I'll select delimited file. I now need to specify the delimiter type, what the text qualifier is, if I need to ignore a header row in my source and what row that would be. Since I'm using a parameter for the source file path, I'm going to identify that here also. And finally, the encoding for the CSV file, I'll use UTF-8. Now, I have the option to manually add columns from my source into the data sync by selecting columns and setting them up individually. Instead, I can actually load all of the metadata into the sync. I can see here, it knows the details of my source based on what I filled in the form. I just need to find the source file and select it. I can see here, all of the columns for my source are appearing. I just now need to select the ones I need for this specific sync. I'll click here to select all of the columns from my source, and then click the load button. Perfect, here they all are. All of my added columns from the source have been tagged as text columns. So for the ones that have different column types, I will go in and adjust them now. The majority of my columns are text type, which is the default that is assigned, but I do need to make some modifications. I'll start with the last contacted date, which is a date type. And next, customer ID, which is a number. Since our target only has a name column and our source has both a first and last name column, I have to create a temporary calculated column that will concatenate both my first and last name from my source into one column in my target. I'll go ahead and enter in the name of my temporary column, the calculation, and the data type for this column. Great. Now that my source is defined, it's time to define the target. I can see from the Select a Sync Target drop-down list the targets that I can choose from. Since this is going into a Cinchy table, the Contacts table, I'll select this one. I need to identify the domain for the target table and the name of the target table. I will also select the option here to suppress duplicate error messages. Like when setting up the source columns that we used in the sync, I have the same ability since I'm using a Cinchy table to load the schema of that table directly here. Because I'm attempting to access a table in Cinchy, it is asking me to put in credentials here. This is to validate that the columns that come back are columns that the user accessing the table actually has access to. I can see here all of the columns that I can bring over, not only the columns where data is entered into the table, but system columns as well. I'll go ahead and pick the columns for this specific sync, and then click the Load button. Perfect. Now it's just a matter of doing the mappings between the source and the target. For corporate ID, it's mapped into customer ID. For company, that is a link column in my Cinchy table, so I have to identify the map column along with the link column name. In this instance, the link column name is name. This is done so that Cinchy can resolve the data as it's being synced into the linked column. If you're unsure of what this value is, you can always validate by looking at how the specific column was set up in Cinchy. I'm going to go ahead and complete the rest of the mappings and identify the link columns where required. Great, now that our mapping is all complete, we just have a few additional things to identify: the sync key reference column and the behavior for new, changed, and deleted records. Next, we have our sync key column reference. This is the reference to the primary column, the column that contains your unique data. Finally, we have to identify the intended behavior when data is being synced. The intended behavior for a net new record being synced into the target, the intended behavior for a record that exists in the target but does not exist in the source, and finally, the intended behavior for a record that exists within the target. I'll save the data sync now. Great. Time to execute the job. I'm using a user called CSV to run the sync. I've created a service account in Cinchy, and these accounts allow for traceability. I'll now choose the file and run the job. I can see here that my sync has run successfully, and 6 records have been processed, and 6 have been added. Let's pop back into Cinchy into the contacts table to validate that the data has been loaded. Here are the records that we synced into Cinchy. I can see all 6 for the client name, Williams Inc. Since the contact table has change approvals enabled, I will need to go ahead and approve the records that have been synced. I'll do that now. Great, they're now all approved. Since the CSV service account user was used to execute the sync, when we go into the collaboration log, we should see that the sync was done by the CSV account and that the approvals were done by Jane's account.